The new CEO arrived at 7:15 in the morning, which I knew because the building's security camera system still fed to my phone. He was dressed for the occasion, a blazer he'd clearly bought recently, still carrying that slightly stiff quality of clothes that haven't been worn enough to relax into a person's body. He was holding a cardboard box, the kind people carry on their first day when they're making a statement about arrival. A custom coffee mug was visible over the rim, his name on the side, and underneath it, a title. He walked up to the main entrance of the 10,000 square foot facility I had spent 10 years building from a leaking, debt-hemorrhaging shell into a manufacturing operation that had been quietly fielding acquisition interest from one of the largest home goods corporations in the country. He tried his keycard. The door didn't open. I watched him try it twice more on the small screen of my phone, standing in my kitchen in the morning quiet, coffee in my own mug, no title on it, just a color I like. He stepped back and looked at the building the way people look at things they don't understand yet. The lights inside were off. The machinery, which on any normal morning would already be running, the CNC routers, the wide belt sanders, the edge banding line I'd negotiated a lease-to-own deal on 3 years ago, was silent because it wasn't there. The sign that had been mounted above the entrance, the company name in brushed steel letters I'd chosen myself from a branding catalog in year 2, had been unmounted. 4 clean bolt holes remained in the concrete facade. My phone started ringing. My former father-in-law. I looked at his name on the screen for a moment, then set the phone face down on the counter and finished my coffee. To understand how a multi-million-dollar company disappears overnight, you need to understand how it was built. And to understand how it was built, I need to take you back 10 years to a Tuesday afternoon when my husband's father called me, his voice doing something I'd never heard it do before, something that sounded, with some effort, like asking. The Callaway family woodworking business had been operating for 22 years when I married into the family at 24. It had been founded by my father-in-law, Gerald, on the premise that handcrafted custom cabinetry and furniture would always find a market, which was true, but also on the premise that passion and reputation were sufficient substitutes for financial management, which was not. By the time I married Daniel Callaway, the company had a good name in a small regional market, a workshop full of skilled craftsmen who hadn't gotten a full paycheck in 6 weeks, and somewhere north of $400,000 in combined vendor debt, back taxes, and an SBA loan that had been restructured twice. The call came 3 months into the marriage. Gerald had just received a letter from the IRS that had reclassified the business's tax status in a way that created an immediate liability. He needed help, not emotional help. He was very clear about that, but the kind of help that involved someone who understood numbers and contracts and what to do when the bank stopped returning your calls. I had spent 4 years at that point building a career in operations management for a mid-sized manufacturing firm. I knew supply chains and vendor negotiations, and how to read a balance sheet the way a doctor reads an X-ray, looking for the thing that doesn't belong. I was 24, newly married, and my husband's family was about to lose everything they'd spent 22 years building. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd stabilize things, set them up with proper systems, and step back into my own career within a year or 2. That was 10 years ago. The first 6 months were the hardest work I have ever done in my life, and I have never said that to anyone in the family, because I learned early that describing the difficulty of the work to the people who weren't doing it generated a specific kind of response. A slight stiffening, a redirect, a comment about how Gerald had built this business from nothing, implying that anything I was contributing was additive at best. So I stopped describing it and just did it. I renegotiated every vendor relationship from scratch, paying down the oldest debts first to restore basic credibility, deferring what could be deferred, and in 2 cases convincing suppliers to convert outstanding balances into extended payment plans in exchange for guaranteed volume commitments. I then had to go out and secure. I built a client pipeline from nothing, cold calls, trade show appearances. A website I designed myself at midnight because we couldn't afford an agency, and landed 3 commercial contracts in the first year that brought in more revenue than the company had seen in the previous 4 combined. I also, in those first months, had to confront something nobody in the family wanted to say out loud. The Callaways could not legally hold a business license, could not sign a commercial lease, and could not open a business bank account. Gerald had a tax lien from a previous failed venture that put him on the state's restricted list. His wife, Patricia, had co-signed enough bad debt in her name to make any bank loan officer close the folder before reaching the second page. Daniel, my husband, had a DUI conviction from his early 20s that disqualified him from certain business certifications in our state. And the youngest son, Marcus, Gerald's golden boy, the one who'd been working the floor since he was a teenager, the one Gerald talked about as the future of the company, was not available at all, because Marcus was 18 months into a 3-year prison sentence for financial fraud. I was the only person in the family with clean credit, no criminal record, and the professional credentials to be taken seriously by a bank. So I signed everything. The LLC registration filed under my name as sole managing member, the commercial lease for the workshop, then later for the expanded facility, the business bank accounts, the trademark application for the company name and logo, which I'd redesigned in year 2 as part of a rebranding push that landed us our first national trade publication feature. Gerald had asked me to do this. He'd sat across from me at his kitchen table with the paperwork from the county and said, "We need someone clean to front this," using the word front in a way that suggested he understood exactly what it meant. I told him I was uncomfortable with the framing. He'd said, "Call it what you want, we just need the signatures." I told him that if my name was on these documents, I needed to understand that I had actual legal authority as the registered owner, not just a placeholder. He'd nodded quickly, impatiently, the way he nodded when he wanted something to be done. I signed, and I filed, and every subsequent document, every contract renewal, every equipment lease, every vendor agreement went through my name because the alternative was operating illegally, and I refused to do that. Over the next 8 years, I built something I'm genuinely proud of, not because I need anyone's validation of it, but because the work was real and the result was real, and pride in good work is one of the things nobody can register in their name but yours. We expanded to a 10,000 square foot facility in year 4. I hired a head of production who transformed our output quality, a CFO who brought in her own network of institutional buyers, and a logistics coordinator who cut our shipping costs by 30% in the first quarter. Annual revenue crossed $2 million in year 5, $4 million in year 7, and by the time of the dinner I'm about to describe, the company was conservatively valued at $12 million and had been quietly approached by a Fortune 500 home goods conglomerate about an acquisition that their representative had described. In a conference call I had taken alone in my office on a Wednesday afternoon, as a serious conversation. I had not yet told Gerald about the acquisition interest. I was waiting for the offer to be formalized. I wanted something in writing before I brought it to the family, because I had learned over 10 years that verbal information shared with Gerald had a way of becoming Gerald's information very quickly. The dinner was Gerald's idea. He'd called it a milestone celebration, a company gala, an evening to honor everyone who had contributed to what the company had become. He'd booked a private banquet room at a hotel downtown, invited all the senior staff, arranged for a catering package that was nicer than anything we'd done before. I thought it was overdue. Honestly, we hadn't done anything formal for the team in 3 years, and morale had been softer than I liked. I wore a dress I'd bought for a board presentation the previous spring and hadn't worn since. I sat at the head table. The room was full of people I'd hired, or whose hiring I'd approved: the head of production, the CFO, the sales team, the floor supervisors who'd been with us since the early years. People who knew what the company had looked like before I arrived, in some cases, and what it looked like now. Gerald stood up after the main course, which was the standard timing for toasts, and I assumed he was going to say something about the company's growth and maybe thank a few people by name. That was the kind of thing you did at a milestone dinner. He did not do that. What Gerald did was deliver a prepared speech. I could tell it was prepared because he was reading from index cards, which he never did, and because the sentences had a formality to them that wasn't his natural register, about the importance of family legacy, about how a business built by a family must ultimately be led by that family, about how the time had come to return the company to its rightful stewardship. And then Marcus walked in. He came through the side door of the banquet room with the particular entrance of someone who had been waiting just off stage. He'd been out for 6 weeks, I knew that. I'd known when he was released because Daniel had mentioned it with a specific careful casualness that meant he'd been instructed not to make a thing of it. Marcus looked good, all things considered. Tan, like he'd spent the 6 weeks somewhere warm. He was wearing a suit. Gerald raised his glass toward his youngest son and said that leadership of the Callaway Company was being passed to the next generation of the family. He said Marcus's name. He said Marcus would be assuming the role of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something happens that nobody knows how to respond to. Gerald reached into his jacket. He produced an envelope. He walked to where I was sitting and set it on the table in front of me, and his hand left it there with the kind of deliberate release that meant he wanted me to understand the gesture. "We want to thank you for your years of service," he said. "The family is deeply grateful." Inside the envelope was a check for $1,000. I looked at it. I looked at the amount and then at Gerald's signature on the bottom and then at the memo line which said consulting services, as if a decade of my life had been an invoice. The CFO was staring at her plate. The head of production had his jaw set in a way that told me he was making a decision about whether to say something. The sales team, the floor supervisors, the people I had hired and trained and fought the budget process to give raises to, all of them were looking somewhere that wasn't at me. Because looking at me in that moment would have required them to acknowledge what was happening, and nobody had prepared for that. Marcus sat down in the chair that had been, until 30 seconds ago, mine. Gerald was already moving on to the next part of his remarks. I picked up the check. I folded it once and put it in my clutch. I picked up my clutch. I stood up from the table and I said nothing, not to Gerald, not to Daniel, not to Marcus. Because there was nothing to say in that room that the room deserved to hear. I walked out through the main entrance of the banquet hall, through the hotel lobby with its fountain and its indifferent ambient music, and out through the revolving door onto the street. The night air was cold. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in. Then I found my attorney's number in my phone, and I called it. She picked up on the third ring. I told her I needed to meet in the morning. She asked if it was urgent. I told her the word urgent implied there was still time pressure involved, and that as of tonight, I wasn't operating under anyone else's timeline anymore. There was a brief silence. 8 o'clock, she said. 8 o'clock, I said. My attorney's name was Renata, and she had been my personal legal counsel for 6 years. Not the company's counsel, mine. A distinction I had been careful to maintain from the beginning because I understood, even in the early years, that in a family business, the interests of the company and the interests of the family are not always the same thing. And when they diverge, you want to be certain whose side your lawyer is on. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, clean-lined and quietly expensive, the kind of space that communicates competence without announcing it. I arrived at 7:55. She was already at her desk with 2 coffees and a yellow legal pad, which told me she'd been thinking since I called. I sat down and I told her everything in the order it happened, the same way I'd described 10 years of company history to myself on the drive over, not emotionally, just sequentially, as a series of facts arranged in time. When I finished, she picked up her pen. "Walk me through the registrations," she said. "Everything in your name. Let's make sure we have a complete picture before we talk about next steps." I opened my laptop. I had a folder, organized, labeled, the way I organized everything that contained the incorporation documents, the trademark certificates, the commercial lease agreements, the equipment financing records, and the business bank account authorizations. 10 years of paperwork, all of it accessible in under 30 seconds because I had scanned and filed every document the week it was signed, which was a habit I'd developed early, and which had seemed, at the time, like ordinary professional diligence. It was considerably more than that now. The LLC first. Registered with the state 10 years ago, sole managing member listed as my full legal name. The Callaway family name appeared nowhere on the LLC registration, because Gerald had been unable to serve as a registered business owner due to his outstanding tax lien, and Daniel had been unwilling to put his name on documents at the time because, and this was the part I'd almost forgotten until I pulled the original email thread, he'd been in the early stages of his own legal situation that he hadn't fully disclosed to me yet. Marcus had been in prison. Patricia had been uninsurable as a business signatory. My name, only my name. The trademark next. The company's name and logo, both registered with the USPTO under my sole ownership 5 years ago, when we'd rebranded and I'd had the foresight to file properly rather than rely on common law usage. A registered trademark means exclusive legal rights to use that name and logo in commerce, and the ability to prevent others from using it, including the family whose name it referenced. The commercial lease. The factory building, 10,000 square feet, signed by me as sole tenant 5 years ago when we expanded, renewed 18 months ago for a 3-year term. My name on the signature line, my personal guarantee backing the lease. The landlord's relationship, legally and practically, was with me. The equipment financing agreements, 7 of them for the major machinery on the floor, the CNC routers, the wide belt sanders, the edge banding line, the dust collection system. All financed through agreements in my name, because the company's credit history was built on my personal credit from the early years, and the institutional financing had followed the same signatory structure. The client contracts. Every major commercial account signed by me as managing director of the LLC. The intellectual property, the proprietary production software we developed in-house in year 6, the client database, the operational systems I'd built from scratch. All of it owned by the LLC, all of it owned by me. Renata had been writing steadily. She stopped and looked up. Is there anything of material value connected to this business that isn't registered in your name or your LLC? She said. I thought about it for a moment. The family has a truck, I said. A delivery van from about 4 years ago. Gerald put it in his wife's name. A van, she said. A van, I said. She put her pen down. Okay, let's talk about what you want. What I wanted was simple, and I told her so. I did not want to negotiate. I did not want a settlement conference. I did not want to sit across a table from Gerald Calloway while he told me what he thought my 10 years were worth and made me a counteroffer. What I wanted was to exercise every legal right I had as the registered owner of every material asset of that business, efficiently and completely within the bounds of the law. Renata nodded slowly. There are 4 primary actions, she said. Trademark revocation, meaning we send notice that the family no longer has your authorization to use the brand name or logo in any commercial context. Lease termination. We notify the landlord that you're exercising your contractual right to terminate, which under your current agreement requires 30 days notice, but can be initiated immediately. Equipment retrieval. The machinery financed under your name can be removed from the premises. We'll need to coordinate with the financing companies and arrange for professional movers. And LLC asset protection. We formally document the transfer of intellectual property, client lists, and proprietary systems to a holding structure under your control. How long does all of that take? I said. The notices can go out today, she said. The physical retrieval of equipment requires scheduling, so 24 to 48 hours for that piece. But legally, the moment those notices are served, they cannot operate under that name or on that property without your authorization. Which means as of today, they don't have a company, I said. As of today, she said. They have a building they can't use, a name they can't use, clients whose contracts run through you, and a van. I looked at her for a moment. Let's start the clock. Renata's paralegal spent the morning pulling every document, cross-referencing the corporate registry, and preparing the formal notices. I sat at the conference table with my own laptop and worked through the client list of 47 active accounts, ranging from small retail orders to 3 major commercial contracts that represented the bulk of annual revenue. Each client relationship was legally tied to the LLC, meaning any attempt by the family to contact those clients and claim to represent the company would constitute both trademark infringement and potential tortious interference. The equipment movers were scheduled for 6 o'clock the following morning. Renata had a relationship with a commercial moving firm that handled exactly this kind of situation, asset retrieval from contested business premises, and they were accustomed to working quickly and quietly. At 2 in the afternoon, the formal notices went out. Lease termination to the landlord, copied to the property management company. Trademark cease and desist to Gerald Calloway, Daniel Calloway, Marcus Calloway, and Patricia Calloway individually, notifying them that any use of the registered company name or logo constituted infringement and would be pursued accordingly. Notification to the utility providers serving the commercial property that the account holder was initiating a service termination request. Notification to the business bank, where I remained the sole authorized signatory, placing a hold on the commercial accounts pending the LLC's transition to a new operating structure. At 4:45, Renata walked into the conference room where I'd been working and set a folder on the table. "Everything's filed," she said. "State records updated, landlord acknowledged receipt, utilities confirmed processing." The cease and desist was delivered to Gerald Calloway's home address at 4:30. I closed my laptop, and the movers are confirmed for 6 tomorrow. 6 a.m., she said. 4 hours to clear the floor based on their assessment. They've done larger jobs in less time. I picked up my bag. I thanked her for the day in the specific way you thank someone who has just helped you dismantle something large and complicated in under 9 hours, which is to say thoroughly and with complete sincerity. Then I drove home, opened the bottle of wine I'd been saving for a night that deserved it, and sat by the window in the quiet of my own apartment, my name on the lease, mine in every way that mattered, and watched the city go dark. My phone had 2 missed calls from Daniel by the time I went to bed. I noted them the way you note the weather forecast for a day you've already decided to stay inside. Then I put the phone on the charger, turned the sound off, and went to sleep earlier than I had in years. The movers arrived at 6 and were done by 9:45. I had driven over to watch the first hour of it, not because I needed to supervise. They were professionals who'd been given a precise inventory and didn't require management, but because some part of me needed to see it. The CNC routers coming off the floor on equipment dollies. The wide belt sanders wrapped in moving blankets. The edge banding line, which had taken 2 days to install when it arrived 3 years ago, loaded onto the truck in under 90 minutes by 4 people who knew what they were doing. The floor supervisor, a man named Earl who'd been with the company for 7 years and who I'd given 2 raises to over that time, was standing in the parking lot when I arrived. He'd shown up for his shift and found the gate locked. He looked at me with an expression that wasn't accusatory, more like someone waiting for an explanation they'd already partly worked out. "Am I still employed?" he said. "The LLC is restructuring," I said. "Anyone who wants to transition with the assets will have that option. I'll be in touch with the full team within the week." He nodded once. "Figured it was something like that," he said, which was the most he said about any of it. I drove back home before Gerald called the first time. He called at 10:17. I know the exact time because my phone logged it and I looked at the log later, the way you review evidence after the fact. I let it ring. He called again at 10:22, then Daniel at 10:31. Then a number I didn't recognize that I assumed was the family's hastily contacted lawyer, though it turned out to be Marcus, who had apparently gotten a new phone since his release. At 11:04, Renata called to tell me that Gerald had shown up at the factory property, that he had attempted to enter the building using a keycard that no longer worked, and that the property management company had confirmed they were not authorized to grant him access as the lease was now in the process of termination. At 11:45, Renata sent a formal cease and desist to a phone number we'd identified as belonging to a social media account Gerald had posted to that morning. A post announcing, with a photo of Marcus, that the company was entering an exciting new era of family leadership. The post used the registered trademark. It was taken down within the hour. At 2 in the afternoon, the family's attorney called Renata's office and requested an emergency meeting. Renata responded in writing, via email, outlining the legal position clearly. The LLC was wholly owned by me, the trademark was registered to me, the commercial lease had been held by me, and the Calloway family members had no legal standing in any of these instruments. Any continued use of the brand name would be pursued as infringement. Any claims regarding the company's assets would need to be filed in the appropriate court and would be addressed through the proper legal process. The meeting request was not repeated. I was making dinner, actually cooking, something I hadn't done on a weeknight in longer than I wanted to calculate, because for years my evenings had ended late enough that dinner was whatever came in a bag from wherever was still open. When I heard the knock at my front door, I knew who it was before I opened it, and I opened it anyway, because some things you need to see with your own eyes to fully close. Gerald was on my doorstep, Patricia behind him, and behind her Daniel, standing at the bottom of the front steps with his hands in his jacket pockets. Marcus wasn't there. I noted that. Gerald had never looked like this before. In 10 years, I'd seen him frustrated, dismissive, imperious, delighted, the full register of a man who'd spent decades operating on the assumption that the world would arrange itself around his expectation. I had never seen him look the way he looked standing on my doorstep at 7 in the evening, which was small. "We need to talk," he said. "Okay," I said. "About the company. About what happened today was, we can work this out. There's been a misunderstanding about the nature of the arrangement, and if you just..." "There's no misunderstanding," I said. "The family built this business." "I built this business," I said, not loudly. Just clearly, the way you state a fact that has always been true and is simply now being said out loud for the first time. "I cleared the debts. I built the client base. I signed the lease and the trademark and the LLC registration because none of you could. Those aren't feelings, Gerald. Those are public records." Patricia said something behind him, a word or the beginning of one, and Gerald put his hand up slightly. The automatic gesture of a man who was used to that working. "We can make this right," he said. "Whatever you think is fair, we'll sit down and..." "There's nothing to sit down about," I said. I looked at him for a moment. At the man who had handed me a check for $1,000 across a banquet table in front of the people whose careers I'd built, and said, "Thank you for your years of service." And I felt nothing that required any further time in this doorway. "I hope Marcus settles in well," I said. I closed the door. Not slammed, just closed the way doors close when you're done with a room. The acquisition conversation with the Fortune 500 company had been at an early stage when everything unraveled, and the collapse of the company's operating structure. No valid trademark, no facility, no functioning management, caused their legal team to withdraw from the process within 48 hours of the first news reaching them. The formal withdrawal letter cited material uncertainty regarding the target entity's legal standing, which was accurate and which I found, reading it in Renata's office a week later, to be a precise and satisfying sentence. The family attempted to file suit. Renata had anticipated this, which is why the legal architecture had been built the way it had been built. And the suit was dismissed at the preliminary stage when the court confirmed that the plaintiff had no ownership interest in the entities named in the complaint. The buyers who had been circling sued the family for misrepresentation, specifically for representing themselves as the owners of an asset they demonstrably did not own. That case moved slowly, the way civil cases do, but it moved in the direction you'd expect. Marcus, as part of an attempt to salvage something from the situation, tried to operate a new woodworking business under a name similar enough to the old trademark to constitute infringement. A cease and desist went out within the week. He violated the terms of his parole in the process of some of what followed, the specifics of which I only know secondhand, and was remanded back to the facility he'd left 6 weeks earlier, which meant the CEO title Gerald had so proudly bestowed at a hotel banquet dinner lasted approximately 3 weeks in total. I sold the client contracts, the proprietary production software, and the equipment through Renata's office to a regional competitor who had been trying to break into our market segment for years. They were motivated buyers. The transaction closed in 11 days. The number was not the $12 million valuation the Fortune 500 company would eventually have offered, but it was substantial, and it was entirely mine, and it arrived in my bank account, my account, my name, on a Wednesday afternoon in early spring. I called Earl, the floor supervisor, that same day, as I'd promised, and offered him a position with the acquiring company at a salary I'd negotiated into the deal terms. He accepted. 3 other members of the senior team made the same transition. I felt good about that. They'd done the work. They deserved the continuity. Daniel and I formalized the divorce 6 months later. It was quiet, mostly. There wasn't much to divide that hadn't already been divided by the simple fact of what was in whose name. I got a new apartment on a higher floor than the old one with a better view of the water. I got a plant for the kitchen windowsill, which I'd always wanted and never had because the previous apartment didn't have enough light. I got to go to sleep on weeknights without thinking about payroll. I got, eventually, a call from a different private equity group interested in a different opportunity. This one in my name from the beginning, with a term sheet that reflected a decade of built reputation and a track record that was entirely and undeniably documented. I took the meeting. The conference room had a long table and good coffee, and people who had done their research before I walked in, which I could tell from the questions they asked. At the end of an hour, one of them leaned back and said, "You built a $12 million operation in 10 years with no institutional backing. What would you do with actual resources?" I thought about a workshop full of craftsmen who hadn't gotten a full paycheck in 6 weeks. I thought about $400,000 of vendor debt and a phone that had stopped ringing when I answered it. I thought about 10 years of 80-hour weeks and a check for $1,000 in a hotel banquet room. "Same thing," I said, "just faster." They offered me a term sheet before I left the building. I signed it, my name, my signature, my company. This time nobody else's.